Today's episode features a story that has two plot twists. If you think the first one is unbelievable, wait until you hear the one revealed at the very end of the story. Back in 2005, 46-year-old Thomas Montgomery was your ordinary guy. He worked as a machinist, volunteered at his church as a Sunday school teacher, and served 6 years in the service as a Marine when he was a young man. Thomas had been married to his wife Cindy for over 20 years, and the couple lived in Clarence, New York with their 2 daughters. With the popularity of the internet growing around this time, Thomas would spend a lot of his free time playing online games and would participate in gaming site chat rooms. In May 2005, Thomas, using the handle Marine Sniper, received a message from another user in the gaming chat room, Pogo. The user, tall, hot blonde, noticed he was possibly in the wrong place based on his profile picture, as the particular chat room was specifically for kids. However, instead of Thomas just explaining that he was harmlessly engaging with fellow users he had been playing with, he decided to tell tall, hot blonde that he was on his father's account, and that he was actually an 18-year-old Marine named Tommy. And as the conversation continued, Thomas became intrigued with the thin, fresh-faced 18-year-old West Virginia girl named Jessie who played softball and was a senior in high school. The two began to exchange pictures. Jessie sent Thomas various photos of her and her team and provocative bikini pictures, whereas 46-year-old Thomas would send Jessie his Marine boot camp photo from 30 years prior. The two would talk constantly, exchanging stories about their lives. Thomas would tell Jessie that he was a trained sniper, hence the screen name, although the truth was, when he was enlisted, he was qualified as a sharpshooter, but never trained as a sniper or even saw battlefield action. But for Jessie, he invented a younger, stronger, more virile version of himself. He was 6 feet tall, had bright red hair with big shoulders and a muscular build. Though initially the conversation between Marine Sniper and tall, hot blonde was friendly, the relationship would become more flirtatious as time went on. And before long, Jessie and Tommy exchanged gifts, phone calls, love letters, and even began to engage in virtual sex. The online relationship began to consume Thomas. He would talk to her any chance he got. There would be days where he would message her until 6 a.m. and was due to go into work at 7. What he and Jessie shared became more real to him than real life. He'd seemed to be losing touch with reality, as he wrote the following note to himself. On January 2, 2006, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is replaced by an 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine who is moving to West Virginia to be with the love of his life. As expected, Jessie began to ask Thomas to come and see her. They would plan multiple visits, which would of course be canceled by Thomas for one reason or another. Thomas eventually decided that the best way to keep Jessie around a little while longer without having to see her was to tell her he was being deployed. First, he was sent away to boot camp, then shipped out to Iraq. He then added to his web of lies by pretending to be Tommy's father. He figured he had to have someone back at home communicating with Jessie while he was supposedly in Iraq. So he posed as Tommy's father, there to comfort Jessie during Tommy's absence. At this point, the couple had been talking for about a year, and Tommy had promised to marry Jessie when he returned home from war. Knowing this wasn't possible, the excitement of a new relationship and the idea of being a young 18-year-old kid again is what motivated Thomas to keep up this elaborate lie. However, the guilt began to eat at him. He was constantly lying to his wife Cindy about what he was doing on the computer for so many hours a day, and the excuses he would tell Jessie about why he couldn't meet her began to take a toll on his health. He was even rushed to the hospital for what he thought was a heart attack, but would later find out was just an anxiety attack. Thomas knew he had to end it, but just didn't know how. Eventually, fate stepped in and Thomas was exposed. Cindy found a package that Jessie had sent to Tommy that contained a letter and a pair of her red panties. She was disgusted that her husband had been having an affair with an 18-year-old and immediately confronted him and asked for a divorce. But before she filed the divorce papers, she sent a letter to Jesse along with this family picture, introducing her to the real Tommy. A few days later, Jesse received the letter and messaged Thomas right away. She told him how hurt she was and creeped out that she had been talking to a man that was her father's age. Thomas, on the other hand, was relieved. He felt like he finally had the weight of all his lies off of his shoulders. Now, to understand the next part of the story, we have to go back to the time when Jesse and Thomas first began their relationship. Before Thomas even met Jesse in the gaming chat room, he was already spending a lot of time gaming and would sometimes play with one of his co-workers, 22-year-old Brian Barrett, who played under the screen name Beefcake. Brian worked part-time at the Dynabraid factory with Thomas, while going to school for teaching at nearby Buffalo State College. He began playing with Jesse and Thomas from time to time once their relationship started. However, he was unaware of Jesse's actual age, nor that the two were in a relationship. So when Jesse found out that Tommy was really Thomas, Beefcake was the only person they mutually knew, so she decided to reach out to him to see if she could get more information on who Thomas was. Brian was shocked to hear what had happened and told Jesse everything she wanted to know. He consoled her and the two became friends, regularly messaging online. And before long, Jesse began exchanging pictures and love letters with Brian. However, Brian didn't realize that Jesse was still talking to Thomas and was using their relationship to make Thomas jealous. She would tell Thomas how Brian was better for her because he was closer to her age and would taunt him with letters and messages the two would exchange. She convinced Brian to help her expose Thomas by entering the game chat rooms and telling everyone that Thomas was a predator, which eventually got Thomas banned from playing. Jesse then had Brian tell their co-workers at the factory that Thomas had been cheating on his wife with an 18-year-old girl. And it worked. Thomas was begging for her forgiveness, professing his love for her. And although Jesse was satisfied that her plan to make Thomas jealous worked, she still continued to engage with both Brian and Thomas without either one of them knowing. Until one day, Thomas overheard Brian in the lunchroom discussing his plans to head down to Virginia to meet Jesse. He didn't confront Brian in person, though. He waited until that evening to message him and confirm if he was really going to meet her, to which Brian never confirmed whether he was or not, but expressed that he didn't understand why Thomas cared anyways. He was too old for Jesse, and Brian told him he should focus on his family, not what he and Jesse had going on. Thomas told Brian how he was hurt that he was ultimately choosing Jesse over their friendship and to never speak to him again, and that would be the last time that the two spoke. Just a few days later, Jesse and Brian would get into an argument, and Jesse too would tell him that she never wanted to speak to him again, as she felt he was only talking to her for sex. And like clockwork, Jesse and Thomas were officially back together again, sexting and all. As the weeks went on, Thomas began to confide in Jesse, telling her how much he hated Brian and that he wanted revenge for the embarrassment he caused him. He told her that eventually Brian will have to pay for what he did. And as a gesture of her supposed loyalty to Thomas, she promised him she wouldn't speak to Brian anymore. And although she kept this promise for a while, she would, however, start talking to other men online, and eventually Brian too, after they became friends on MySpace. This infuriated Thomas. And sadly, 2 days later on Friday, September 15, 2006, Brian exited the Dynabraid plant doors at 10 p.m. and walked to the back of the empty parking lot where his truck was parked. As he sat inside and before starting his vehicle, Thomas Montgomery quickly approached the truck and shot him 3 times. Tragically, because the plant was only open Monday through Friday, and Brian had no weekend plans, his body wasn't discovered until 2 days later. Once the investigation into Brian's murder began, the police quickly learned of the issues between Thomas and Brian, and when they couldn't locate Thomas, they feared that he had plans to hurt Jesse too. One of the younger detectives was able to locate Jesse by searching Brian's MySpace account, and once they discovered that she was down in West Virginia, they immediately contacted the local police department. Officers were dispatched to Jesse's house at 6 a.m. They knocked on the door, which was answered by an older lady. She explained that she was Jesse's mom and that Jesse didn't live there anymore and had no way to contact her. The police became frustrated with her as they tried to explain that they needed to speak to her daughter as soon as possible as she may be in danger. Jesse's mother could sense that something terrible had happened based on the demeanor of the officers and began to cry. Not because she was afraid for her daughter's safety, but because she knew she would have to reveal that she had been posing as her daughter online under the handle Tall Hot Blonde. Jesse, the real Jesse, never wrote a single word to Thomas or Brian. It was her mother, Mary Sheeler, who had been sending out her daughter's pictures in lingerie and sexting men online. She used her own daughter as bait. When police were able to finally track down Thomas, he initially denied any involvement in Brian's murder. However, a peach pit left at the scene matched his DNA. The gun clip near Brian's truck was traced back to Thomas, and after reviewing hundreds of thousands of messages on his computer, it was very clear that Thomas committed the crime. Once in custody, he was handed a picture of who he'd been messaging for the past 2 years. Not the 18-year-old girl he'd thought, but a 46-year-old mom and wife. Thomas Montgomery was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As far as Mary Sheeler, although when her computer was confiscated and thousands of pictures of her daughter were discovered that had been sent to several men online, she was never criminally charged in the case. However, her life completely fell apart. When her family became aware of what she had done, her husband filed for divorce. Her daughter Jessie cut off all communications with her, and she moved back home with her parents. The uniqueness of this case is that everybody appeared to be misleading everybody else, and the whole situation, which resulted in a violent death, was unnecessary. Ironically, the only person telling the truth was the victim.